You're listening to Big Blend Radio's English Connection Show with Glynn Burrows, owner of Norfolk Tours. Welcome, everyone. You know, it is May, and May is Military Appreciation Month, and we are at Memorial Weekend right now. Memorial Day is on Monday, but I think this whole month just reminds us of all the sacrifices people have made throughout all the wars in the world. I mean, and if you want to sit and count all the wars, we'd be here for a long time, unfortunately, because us humans do things. But a lot of people made a lot of sacrifices that were necessary. And World War One and Two is probably those were the big world wars when you think of it. And Glenn is here as usual every fourth Saturday, and he's going to touch on, looking at the history of England and those who fought in World War One and Two. So, Glenn, it's just a lively conversation. These kinds of topics are sad, but I think it's so important that we always have these conversations so that we don't forget history and so that we don't replay history.
Mm. I think that memorials are always good because I mean, for someone of my age, I've never actually lived through a major conflict that affects me. Obviously, with in England we had the Falklands War, we've had the Gulf War and all of that, but actually it's not on my doorstep. My parents lived through the Second World War. My grandparents lived through the First World War and the Second World War when it was actually on the doorstep, you know,
Mm.
and that is a different thing altogether. My dad used to tell stories about things that were going on his doorstep when he was a child. He was 6 when it started in the World War Two and 12 when it finished, and he
Oh,
remembers he remembers seeing bombs being dropped on his local town. He remembers once when he was quite small, he lived near a railway line, and he remembers seeing an aeroplane following the railway line. So he went outside in the garden and was waving to this pilot who was flying along the railway line. And his mum came out and dragged him indoors because it was a German aircraft that was trying to find the way to King's Lynn along the railway line. Now, my dad remembers that the pilot waved to him because pilots are men as well, and they probably had children at home. But things like that, I never experienced close contact with a war. So
mm.
I'm really
Yeah,
lucky.
you are. You are. When you think about the, 6 years of that is actually pretty traumatic because
Yeah,
you don't, and then even hearing those sirens when it's like the
oh,
bomb sirens,
yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of, I've heard sirens like that, and that is a very freaky feeling. I mean, you get them
yeah,
with tornado warnings, you get them with all kinds,
yeah.
but those warning sounds are chilling.
Yes, and the noise of the aircraft. My granddad, he was out ploughing in the field once a few years ago. This would have been in the late 60s, early 70s, and he was out in his field ploughing, and he heard a German aircraft flying over. He jumped out of his tractor and got underneath it because that's what he
Yeah,
did. He didn't realize that it was the late 60s, early 70s, and they were filming the Battle of Britain, a film that was being made. And they were flying in aircraft from all over the country. But he heard this aircraft, he recognized the noise. And the first thing he did, without even thinking, was get under his tractor. So
yeah.
it's impregnated into your brain. You
Yeah,
know,
Nancy in school said that they were taught to go under their desks.
yeah,
All of them had drills to go under their desks
yeah,
at times, So it's, and then you look at Vietnam Wars, you look at all these wars, but to think about, I think now, I mean, we've of course had the Gulf War, Desert Storm, all of that. And Prince
yeah.
Harry is actually part of one of our broadcasts. Well, no,
Oh, yeah.
he's not on the show. That would have been fun.
That would have been
Um,
good.
yeah, but he served, over here. He trained here, so in the
Yeah,
States. So it's interesting how we rotate between each other. But it's when you look on the news and you see numbers, and this is something I've said through all this programming we're doing all weekend, all Memorial Weekend long, is the numbers. we become desensitized, and
Yeah.
you've until you hear personal stories, or stories, doesn't even have to be related to you, but understand what war is, what it smells like, the textures. And you've got an article in everyone, it's linked in our episode notes, and also Glenn's website is norfolk-tours.co.uk. Just got to put it in there for people to, because you take them to these memorial sites in England,
Oh,
because a
yeah.
lot of
Oh,
us
yeah.
came over to England, and Norfolk, your backyard was,
Yeah.
a training ground. And so when you look at these numbers on the telly, or not, see, did I just say telly? I
You
totally
did.
went English. I did go English. Yeah, I the telly. Um, when you see those numbers, we forget that that's a number of people.
They're real
That
people.
is human beings. And
Yeah.
we always look, okay, they've passed or been shot down or injured.
Yeah.
Wounded at war is also a horrific thing. And you've got to think what we have now today in the medical world, in technology, painkillers, what they had in World War I and II. I
Oh,
don't know, man. I think I might have just, taken myself out at some of the things that they went
yeah.
through.
I mean, the thing that we always realize is that through necessity, things happen. So many things are developed through war and, through really bad times. So during the First World War, if you think about it, aircraft had only been invented in 1902, and by 1916, during the middle of the First World War, aircraft were being used to drop bombs, to use machine guns. The development just over a decade was amazing. And
Hmm.
if you also look at the Second World War, the development of aircraft not from 1939 onwards was just totally amazing how they all just ran forward. And so many things were invented during wartime because they need to do it.
Hmm.
They need to hit the ground running. So that's just the aircraft. But I mean, when you're talking about ways to deal with problems, again, if you've got lots of people who had their legs blown off, which they did, you've got to find a way to deal with it. And when you're dealing with lots of people with the same problem, you then find ways to make it easier for the medics and also for the people. After the First World War, there were so many men who came back with no legs. So they had to invent new wheelchairs. They had to invent,
Wow.
loads of different things. And
Mm.
again, with the Second World War, especially, there were a lot of people who came back um, blinded or with chemical burns or with things like that. So that is where a lot of plastic surgery came out. So plastic
Hmm.
surgery. So if anybody listening has ever had plastic surgery, a lot of the techniques involved in plastic surgery today originated from World War II because so
Wow.
many people came back with massive burns and chemical burns and lots of stuff like that. That the chemical, the plastic surgery went on and on and on so quickly that it developed. So,
Hmm.
there's obviously awful things about war.
Yeah.
The advances that are made during wartime are unbelievable. They really are.
Well, the advance, yeah. I mean, even looking how flight. You've been on this show with us on the Hardwick. Was it the Hardwick
Yeah, yeah, yep,
battalion, the ones that flew, and
yep,
the Millionaires Club, where how the Air Force started with the Yale people, and they went to England, to your backyard, and
yeah,
how planes developed, and now we have drones. Go figure. We were talking about drones right before we recorded. Look at
yep,
how it is so changed over the years. So, and then look at how women got in making manufacturing,
mm,
during the war over here, helping with all kinds of things that needed to be manufactured, ammunition and things like that. Rosie the Riveters. So in England, did that happen as well? Like what we
oh,
have is, okay,
so
I
much.
gotta ask, making sure.
Yeah, I mean, not 90% of the men were away at war. So the women went in all the factories, especially during First World War. I mean, the women were in the factories making the munitions and doing everything, and also working on the farms. because
Mm,
so many of the young men were away at war. The women came on board and worked in the farms.
mm,
Um, the Women's Land Army was in the First World War as well as the Second World War. And, obviously the farms kept the experts, like my granddad never went away to war because he was in what was called a reserved occupation. He was in charge of a team of horses on a farm, so they needed his expertise and they couldn't let him go to war. So
mm.
he stayed at home, but he was in the Home Guard. And if any of you have ever seen Dad's Army, that's that sort of thing. Um, he was also, and he never talked about it. I never heard about it from him at all. My dad told me years later that he was in what was called the left behinds, which was going to be a certain number of well-trained young men if there was an invasion, because we're on the East Coast, which was easy for Germany to invade. If Germany did invade, my granddad would have been left on the front line, and my dad, his brother, and my grandmother would have went
Mm.
inland, and all the young men, which was who were still left at home, would have been on the front line to protect the country. But
Wow.
thank God, it never happened.
So Guernsey, I want to talk about Guernsey because it's not that far from you, Glenn, right? It's kind of, yeah, the
It's in the channel.
we could have waved at you when we like if we had known you at that
Yeah, you'd,
point.
you'd you'd need some very long arms.
Yeah. Well, Nancy and I stayed there for about a month on our way from South Africa to the States when we were moving, and my step grandfather's from there, and he was talking about how Guernsey in the Channel Islands was occupied by he says everything was during the occupation, in the occupation. I mean, a lot of stories. He told a lot of stories,
Yeah.
and he was a gardener, a horticulturist, and he said they took his radio away. They took like you were controlled by food and everything, and it wasn't good food that they were given. In fact,
Oh,
a lot of the friends and everything, his friends and family, they were getting scurvy from not having the right food. So he was growing tomatoes where they couldn't see him. He knew how to make his own battery. I mean, not his own battery, but he did. He knew how to make his own batteries to make his own radio, which is insane. And I know that for a fact. I've seen how he can do it. I was like, wow, and he somehow survived through all of that.
mm,
And he was actually, because he's a very simple, or he was, may he rest in peace. He was a very simple kind of person. He just wanted to be out in the garden and with the animals and birds and flowers. So he just kind of looked at it. It was like, oh, well, this is happening. All right, I'm
mm,
alive. I'm not fighting in the war, but they've taken over our islands. And he did what he could to sneak food to friends, family, and everyone there and try and grow it where they wouldn't be caught. So he took us to, and Guernsey's charming, man. We just didn't get to Jersey, which is not Jersey, it's Sark that I wanted to go because of Gerald
oh, yeah.
Durrell. But
Yes. Oh,
he took us to this historic area, and I remember there was a church made of shells and flint, I think,
yeah.
little
Yeah.
churches, and then he took us to this underground hospital. And this
Yeah.
they were like miniature churches, like little ones. But they're little people there too. They're kind of smaller. Well, they're island people. I just remember maybe I just felt no, not little people like that. No, not miniatures, but like they're just a little smaller than, us big Americans. That's,
Okay.
even my Nana's real small. Then something happened when we became American. We
Could
we
be.
ate the Jolly Green Giant or something. But anyway,
But
getting
pizza.
yeah, it's the pizza. Here we are again. Getting back to it. We can't even take a serious topic without getting
Sorry.
silly,
Sorry.
but but he took us to this hospital and the beds were still in it. It was underground, like, so it
Yeah.
was hidden almost like a bunker, like it was hidden. There was water dribbling down the walls and moss, and it freaked me out a little bit. It did. It kind of gave me I felt like a lot of walking through a lot of like you could just envision what has happened there, like the pain, people going through pain and dying in there when I walked through. And I was like, "Oh, wow, this is some intense." This was, I think, probably my first real World War experience was that hospital, and it made it very real from all the books I'd read. Like I read Leon Uris and all those books when I was a kid, you know, and so this kind of made
I
it
don't
home.
know. I don't know them books. But yeah, Jersey and Guernsey were the only places, the only UK places that were actually occupied by the Germans. So they were the only part of the UK that was conquered, you could say. And
Mm,
yeah, I mean, I've heard lots of stories about Jersey and Guernsey. In fact, three ladies, sorry, who were over last week from Canada, and I was showing them around Norfolk. That actually stopped off in Jersey because part of their family came from Jersey, and they were saying how beautiful it was. But
mm.
yeah, funny enough, my grandmother went to that underground hospital, and she told me that it was really strange. I think that's the word she used, because
Yeah,
it's so unusual and so eerie. But
it's creepy. Well,
yeah,
and I can't say that it's my first World War II, but I think for my age, I got it. But when we
yeah,
lived in England, I was so little, I was still, getting over the fact that you had all these kings and queens, and there were so many different royalty people. I'm like, I can't remember them all for a class. But
yeah, yeah.
well, it's true. I was trying to learn all of it and going to the castles. I was kind of stuck in the ancient times, in medieval times, and
Mm.
in World War One and Two. And I don't think people at that time, I mean, we're looking at the 80s, mid 80s maybe, we're talking too much about it. I don't think it wasn't, because Vietnam had happened after that. We still had the Cold Wars going on. I don't think it was a big conversation, maybe. I don't
Yeah,
know.
but you see, the thing is, for a lot of people in England, especially, well, in the UK, I'll say, um, the war, but in the 1980s, it was still very fresh. You
Mm.
know, a lot of people who were alive in the 80s, were actually serving in the war. So they didn't talk about it. I mean, I know people who were Japanese prisoners of war and they never
Oof.
mentioned it. They never mentioned it. I didn't know they were Japanese prisoners of war until they died and it was in their obituary. Never spoke about it. They just didn't speak
Yeah,
because
well, they call it the silent generation.
yeah, they just didn't want to talk about it. And when you actually hear the stories, you can understand why. You
Mm.
know, nowadays we talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you imagine what it's like? One of the stories I share in my article, one of my relations was actually in the First World War. I went to see him when he was in his 90s, and he told me that one of the things that he remembers is standing shoulder to shoulder with one of his mates, and he sort of felt just that, just like
Hmm.
someone had just hit him on the shoulder. And that was the feeling of his mate being shot.
Oh,
That was the feeling of the bullet killing his mate.
that's
He could feel it through his mate. Can you
that's
imagine?
horrific.
Can you imagine it? You're just standing shoulder to shoulder having a chat with somebody, and suddenly you feel poof, and he's dead.
Mm.
Just unbelievable.
It's sad.
The man over my shoulder is my
Yes.
great uncle. He he's no more than 24 in that picture because he died when he was 24 in on the approaches to Singapore.
No.
You know, he was only a young bloke and he never came home. Well, they think he died. They've got no idea what happened to him.
Oh my
You know,
gosh, missing in action is the
yeah, yeah,
scariest.
missing in action. No idea what happened. And like I said, he can't be any more than 24 in that picture
Mm.
because he died when he was 24.
That's why it's so important to have these conversations. Just like I was saying, to make it real and understanding. And Memorial Day over in this country tends to have furniture sales and this sale and that sale, and it's a day off, and on the Monday, Memorial Monday, is supposed to be pay respect, get together. So there's people having barbecues, right, and families getting together, which I think is good. And the conversation should be had about who served and sacrificed,
Yeah.
in our family. Whether some people were taken by draft, not everybody said, "Oh, yippee, let's go to war." You know.
I mean, it is a good time for families to get together for it to be passed down the generations.
Hmm.
Because my dad always used to talk about his Uncle George. I don't know which shoulder
Hmm.
he's at. Talk about his Uncle George. He remembers Uncle George going away to Singapore. He remembers him walking around the corner of the house whistling as he went. And my dad was no
Mm.
more than it was no more than 10 because Uncle George died when my dad was 10. So my dad was no more than 10. And he remembers Uncle George going away and never coming back, you
Mm.
know. So it is family stories like that that my dad told me that I can pass on to my children and to my grandchildren so they will remember that someone connected to us, really close to us, actually died in the war, gave his
And
life for today. You know, they do
yeah.
say, don't they? You know, they gave our today for our tomorrow. You know, gave
Hmm.
today for our tomorrow.
Yeah.
Um, you know, because that's what it is. You know, and
And we
the more
owe
people
doing the
who
right
are,
thing. We owe doing the right thing now for what
oh,
they sacrificed for us.
so many times do I hear people say, "Oh my God, them people, if only they could see what this world has turned into, would they think it was worth it?" You know,
Mm,
and
that's
sometimes I
sad.
wonder,
Well, when
sometimes,
you look at your grandkids, aren't you happy and saying they're here? They don't, so
but sometimes when you see what's going on in the world, you think, they gave their lives all them years ago, and now look what we've done to the
we're
world.
teetering. We're teetering.
Yeah, look what we've done to it, you know.
We're on a very fine line of what we're doing in war, what we're doing with climate. We're on a very fine line, and I think the world could use a dose of diplomacy,
Just a bit.
just a bit, some respect, and go back to compassion, communication with compassion, and all those things. And so, I mean, for Memorial Day now, like, I'm so glad we're doing all these shows. But do you celebrate or honor and observe Memorial Day in England in May, or do you stick
Oh
to
no,
the one in November?
ours is Poppy Day in November,
Well, I
the
got the
11th.
poppies.
Yeah, the
That's
11th of
actually
the
an
11th.
Australian picture, but
Oh,
then that's related. They're
the
English.
Australia, well, so many countries fought in the war, and they don't get forgotten or overlooked, but they get put sidelines. There are so
Mhm.
many, especially for England, so many of our um countries that we ruled fought for us during the war. So we had Indian soldiers, we had Australian soldiers, New Zealand soldiers, Canadian soldiers. Every country in the world was fighting for somebody, and all of these little islands in the middle of nowhere that were part of British territory, they sent their men, the Gurkhas.
Mm.
I mean, the Gurkhas were amazing soldiers. They probably still are amazing soldiers, but it weren't just English people who were fighting for England. It was the world. It was a world war, and it was the world. We're all fighting.
Universal justice.
Oh, well, let's hope so. But yeah, we commemorate on the
Yeah,
11th
there
of
you go.
November.
Yeah, so no, that's Veterans Day is for us, Veterans Day. So Memorial Day here is about respecting those who have passed and sacrificed, who are passed on now. And then
Hmm.
Veterans Day is for those who are serving and have served and are still with us in
Right.
life. I think both are so crucial to just always remind everybody that war it's kind of like, if you look at it, shouldn't be romanticized, is my point, or
No.
ignored with the numbers. It's the it is so brutal, and what they go through. I mean, even if you think about World War II, there's a story of them, being out in the snow and fighting in the snow, in the freezing cold.
Oh
I don't
yeah,
want that. And
and
getting
in the
on
desert.
boats, you're getting on boats where there's sharks. Thank you, Julia Child, for making shark repellent. That was her first recipe that got famous, you know.
Right.
So I think, and
It's
women did so much too. So it's
well,
amazing.
exactly like I'm saying, it was all over the world were fighting, and the women, not only were the women fighting in places, but the women were keeping the country going.
Hmm.
That's another thing that we forget, we overlook the fact that the women were left behind to basically make sure everything else was going on okay. And it weren't about politics or anything. It was all about just working together.
Mm.
And during the war, there were very often, during wartime, you'd get coalition governments where the whole government just works together for a common good. Why don't we do that all the time?
I think it's,
why don't we do that? Why don't we
I don't
just
know,
all
because
work together?
power and greed got together and had fun.
I'm afraid so.
Well, I do want to touch on the memorials in England because I know there's World War II airfields. We've talked about that, that people
Yeah.
from that families here in the States who had ancestors that fought in the war and flew in the war. Norfolk in England's got a lot of history that you can go. And Glenn, you do that a lot. You take people to their family history sites or where they fought. The other thing I wanted to touch on is in your article, you put in a very sobering fact of basically every town, and I think this is across America too, has a memorial for World War I and World War II. So it really gets to a point where when you look at these world wars, every family in England, and I'm going to say here too, because we also had like code talkers and we had the Tuskegee Airmen, we had all these different people come together, right? And I would say every family in the world was affected by these wars. And it's I know
Yeah.
it's a world war, but every family was affected. So if you look at something like a disease like cancer or heart disease, right? And we always look at, oh, 1 in 4, 1 in 3, one in this. Well, war is like 1 out of 2 because it's one person going to fight. The second one is back home doing something to help or, keep a family going.
That is one of the things that you especially notice in England as you're driving around the countryside. Every single village has got a war memorial with a whole list of names of men from that village or town or city who died during either World War One, World War Two, or both. And that is just amazing to think that even the tiniest of village, when you probably only got 20 people living in it, there were probably three, four, five people from that village who were killed. And when you realize that everybody who was alive during that time knew somebody who died, that that really brings it home.
Yeah.
Everybody who was alive during that time would have known somebody, or they would have had close family members, or the next door neighbor, or John up the road. They would have known someone well who died, and that is really something, like you say, a very sobering thought that it
Mm.
affected every single person.
I think this is always a good conversation for people to understand that, war is something serious, but when they go to England, it's something that they can experience in their family and, and pay tribute and honor to those of the past. So, everyone, again, Glenn's article is linked in the episode notes, and you can go to Norfolk-Tours.co.uk. You almost thought I wasn't going to get it, but I know it
Yep,
after all
you
these
got it.
years.
You got it.
So thank you so much, Glenn.
You're more than welcome. Yeah, that's a very poignant thing to talk about, but I think something, the conversation that needs to be had.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us for Big Blend Radio's English Connection show with Glynn Burrows, owner of Norfolk Tours. If you're planning a vacation to England or looking up your family history in England, visit norfolk-tours.co.uk to connect with Glynn. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.